You are listening to Off the Shelf, a podcast by The Conference Board.
Hello, my name is John Metselaar, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to this edition of Off the Shelf, a series which helps senior executives address challenges and stay informed about current issues ahead of the market trends. This series is brought to you by The Conference Board. Today, I'll be sitting down with Ron Adner, Leveron Memorial Professor of Business Administration and Professor of Strategy and Entrepreneurship at the Tuck School of Business at Dartmouth. That sounds all excellent and really promising. But the reason why we're talking here is because he also wrote a classic book by now, I'm convinced, which is called Winning the Right Game: How to Disrupt, Defend, and Deliver in a Changing World. Ron, I'm so glad I finally caught you after you not being available during your book tour for obvious reasons, and I know that you have created a generous impact in terms of making your book become visible to the broader world. Welcome to this session. I'm thrilled to talk to you.
Well, John, it's great to be here, and thanks for having me.
So why don't you start off telling a bit of the background on how come you how did you write the book? What started? What was the initiative, and maybe also a bit of, about your history, because I know you've written a book before.
Yeah. So my deep background is I was in engineering and became very convinced that the challenges of innovation that were being framed as technology challenges were missing at least half the point. And it was this sensibility that led me, one, to do a PhD at a business school rather than an engineering school, but also took me on this journey of trying to look at what determines innovation success. And kind of really encapsulated in my first book, The Wide Lens, it was, how do we understand the difference between great innovations that succeed and great innovations that fail? Right? So not bad innovations that fail, but how do we confront the reality that sometimes there are genuinely great innovations, not inventions, real innovations that fail. And that opened up the world of what is now become this terribly popular term of ecosystems, which is, how do you see beyond the need to execute on a great initiative to have competitive advantage, which is hard enough on its own, to expand your lens to think about the partners that need to be aligned in order for your great innovation to actually deliver its total value proposition. And that led me to this world of ecosystems. That led to the first book, The Wide Lens. And then once that body of thinking was in place, at least in my head, the next journey was, if we understand that the approach to innovation itself needs to change, and we can see that the really successful companies today are pursuing this new mode of growth, how does that require that we change the way we think about strategy writ large? Right? How does the way we think about competition need to change as we move away from a world of well-defined industries into a world of ecosystems? And that's where this new book
And I'm
came.
so keen to hear you talk about this and lay out your principles. But before we do that, you already mentioned a few so important points, which is, innovation is not invention. We keep on getting this right, and and that leads me to the other one. Innovation is only successful when it creates value, right? It creates value for your customer, creates value for your company, for your stakeholders, and for society. So how do you go and generate that, being customer centric and not technology driven? And the other thing is you mentioned, how do you go and persist in that innovation, in delivering on that innovation? It's not only about creativity. We have this what I think Tendai Viki calls innovation theater, where we have a lot of post-its and hackathons and whatever. And the senior leadership is showing to Wall Street how innovative the company is. The hard work, I say innovation is 1% inspiration, 99% perspiration. For the loyal listeners, I'm sorry to repeat the point, but it's so important. How do you go and take your ideation into successful value creation, and capturing for value creation for the consumer and capturing for yourself? Now, Ron, I know you're setting up your story by explaining how today's world is different from the world before, by explaining disruption, how that happened in the previous world and how disruption happens today. Why don't you talk a bit about that, and maybe give an example of disruption in that previous world, just to set us up in terms of, so how are we going to go and develop and execute that strategy point that you made before?
Yeah, so it's a great question, right? So if we if we step back and we think about strategy writ large, right, I would argue that the history of strategy is rooted in a starting assumption that firms live in industries and then everything happens from there, right? And it's interesting because the definition of what it is in industry has always been quite fuzzy, but we've been able to get away with this fuzziness when, banks look like banks or car manufacturers look like car manufacturers, and Toyota and Ford and GM, they had different ways of maybe building the product, but it looked pretty similar, right? So that's kind of classic industry view. Classic disruption, a la Clay Christensen, was a kind of a conceptual highlight, which said, sometimes the competition looks different from what you're used to, right? So if you think about, the classic disruption examples of how mini mills displaced integrated mills, or how discount airlines disrupt full service airlines, the story there is these guys are starting in a different segment. They have a different activity set. They have a different cost structure, and they come in and they disrupt. And that was, really about as dynamic as strategy has been for the last 20 years, I would say. If you step back, what you realize, though, that all those stories take place, there's a lot of action among the competitors, but the game, what it is that you're trying to do, doesn't change, right? Mini mills are still selling steel by the ton. Discount airlines are still selling airline tickets. And the challenge is that today, right, online banks were doing banking in a more nimble way than full service banks. But today, when we talk about fintech, that doesn't no longer fits that mold, right? That is what it is that's being discussed. When you think about mobility today, and Tesla pulling together not just cars, motors with batteries, but charging infrastructure and over-the-air software updates, et cetera, right? This is a different kind of disruption. And that's the starting point for this book, which is historically, when we've thought about disruption, it was really about technology substitution and whether you could see it coming. And
At a
whether
lower price, usually, right? At a
right.
lower cost.
So classic disruption was an inferior technology that comes in at a lower cost, and at some point it becomes good enough, and then it competes for what the old home market was. But that home market didn't change. What the proposition was didn't change. Whereas today, much more of what we're seeing, both from the threat as well as opportunity side, it's a redefinition of what those classic industry boundaries look like.
And we're started to see that for some time. If you take the iPhone as an example, you start to see already how that breaks apart, or actually makes disappear, annihilates existing industries. Right? When you look at the camera business, when you look at the music business, when you look at the flashlight business, we've seen that happening for some time. But in today's world, that cross industry dynamic is appears to be playing out much more significantly. The opportunities are there. The digitalization opportunities are creating a whole new world full of opportunities that go way beyond the existing industry. So breaking through that industry limiting thinking feels absolutely the right thing to do for corporations to go and be successful in the future, and not be annihilated by new players coming in, or more creative players that are able to go and create integrated solutions versus just products or services, integrated solutions for that consumer that represents that value proposition that is so important. Now, so with that grounding, what do companies need to do to get this right? How do they need to organize in this new reality?
So I think both sides of that are 100% right. So one is, yes, all that's true. We know the world is changing. We know we need to move around. And then, but the last little follow-up there is, and what we need is more than just to be able to say that, right? I think maybe 15 years ago, there was information in saying, hey, the world is going to change. Today, I think just about certainly anybody listening to a show like this knows that in their bones.
Well, that's
So
why I'm asking the question. We need tangible handles, Ron.
Exactly. So this is kind of what I want to really clarify is that the heart of this book is not some claim of, oh, you need to be paying attention. It's here are the concepts and the tools and the frameworks that you can actually use in order to see what's happening, respond to what's happening, and shape what's happening.
So how do you create that value architecture, as you call it in the book, which I love as a definition or as a description or a definition, both, to go and create that consumer value proposition?
Yeah. So the starting point, which was kind of for me was a big discovery and trying to wrestle. So all right, the first chapter in the book, the first case that I take on is the story of Kodak, which is it's the most overtold story in modern business. And by the way, the claim is going to be that the story that you've known, have believed, and possibly retold turns out to be 100% wrong. And that's what's going to make this so interesting. So the classic story of Kodak is it's a company that it invented digital photography and then was too inert, organizationally too ossified to make the transition from their core traditional business in chemical photography, where they were making all this money in consumables and the films and the inks and the paper, to be an effective competitor for digital. And that's why they go bankrupt, right? That's the story we tell. Why that happens, people will say it's because they couldn't adapt or they wouldn't adapt, what have you. So the starting point for this book is to first clarify that story is 100% wrong. That, Kodak kind of stumbled throughout the 90s trying to figure out what they wanted to do with digital photography. But starting in 2000, they undertake an incredibly ambitious and successful transformation to become a leading digital photo printing company. They become the number one seller of digital cameras in the US. They become a top seller of inkjet printers. They are, even today, certainly in the US, if you go into a pharmacy like a CVS or a Walgreens, you will still see their printing kiosks, those yellow boxes that you can go and print your images. Kodak drove Fuji out of 8,000 key accounts to get that, right? So Kodak was incredibly successful, it turns out, in becoming a dominant player in digital photo printing. They're still going to go bankrupt, but what kills them is not that they couldn't make this transformation. It's not that they couldn't manage the classic technology substitution that everybody said would be impossible. It's that what really disrupted them was that the very notion of digital printing collapses with the rise of digital viewing. Right? This is a different kind of disruption. And by the way, even though Kodak is the one we talk about, that same dynamic upended Hewlett-Packard and Lexmark and everybody else in that business. So the question becomes, how can you look beyond just technology substitution in the industry box to see these kinds of what I talk about as cross-box dynamics? And so the first concept that I developed in order for myself to understand this in a systematic way, like so I can tell you now, the thing that killed Kodak was the iPhone, right? It wasn't any organizational inertia. But having that as a statement and intuition, that's good for the story. The question is, how do you generate that as a systematic insight looking forward into other settings? And that's where this concept of a value architecture emerges. And by the way, for listeners who are interested, this is all in the first chapter of the book, and the entire first chapter is posted on my website for free for you to read and share and make use of so it's at ronadner.com. The value architecture idea is, how can we look at a value proposition from a different angle? How do we have a process for, essentially it's like design thinking from the innovator side rather than from the customer side? How do we think about what are the elements of value? And then with that in place, there's a method for looking at a potential change, seeing which of those elements are being impacted. And what that does is it raises the key. So the key to ecosystem disruption, classic disruption came about as substitutes became good enough and entered your market.
Right.
Ecosystem disruption is driven not by substitutes, but by existing partners that are changing the landscape around you. So this is disruption through complements rather than disruption through substitutes. And that is a profound shift from the way we know to think even about basic economics, right? Basic economics, I know I have rivals, that's bad. I have substitutes, that's bad. I have complements, that's good. And here, the dynamic that gets revealed, what I talk about as value inversion, is a process where complements get better and better, and then they get to a point of becoming too good, and they cross over and disrupt, right? So where substitutes become good enough and disrupt, complements can become too good and disrupt. And if you're not ready for that, that is a totally different world of pain. Because unlike a new entrant that needs to, now they have their technology being good enough, they need to claw their way into the market. The complementer's already there, already at scale, with relationships with both consumers and other partners. So when they cross this line, all kinds of things change. And again, this requires a language for seeing. And then once you see it, it requires an additional tool set for, well, how do you respond? And, again, I keep talking about the book, but I guess that's why you invited me. That's what the book is about.
The book is profound. And I think the other thing I want to reinforce here before we jump into how do you go about building that ecosystem that you keep talking about is I love what you said, winning the right game. In the past, winning the right game meant within one industry, somebody was winning and the other one was losing. And in this world in the world we just described, it is about collaboration. It is about appropriate partnerships. It is about making connections. It is about having a broader view, and then creating that alignment for the various players to come together. But that's only the basis of it, right? Because you go several steps further to go and describe that. So
no, completely, and that's like, so the point of the Kodak story is to illustrate what happens when you win the wrong game, right? So they accomplished the impossible. They became this amazing digital printing company, but it turned out to be the wrong game to go after. And again, this is what makes this ecosystem world more interesting, both kind of in the good way and the bad way, than an industry world where now part of what you need to choose is the game that you're going to play on this board, recognizing that others will be playing on the same board their own game. And it's not enough to just be as good as the rest. You need to figure out your own path.
Yeah, and it also starts from a leadership mindset, right? As I always talk about, it needs to start at a growth mindset, not at a fixed mindset where you cannot get your mind off of our business is in prints. Our business is in printing. The world changes, and having that imagination, creating the possibilities, is, I think, an important priority today for leadership. Other than the alignment that needs to be created, obviously, to bring the various parties together.
Yeah, it's creating the possibilities, but then, as you just said, critical is the change in mindset required to think about partners in a new way.
Yeah,
right. That the ecosystem game is all about the need to move partners into new positions and finding an equilibrium, finding a strategy that makes sense both for you and for them. Right. So part of it is sensing what's moving, and the other is shaping what the outcomes are going to look like.
So we talked about this notion conceptually now for a few minutes. Why don't you go and tell the Alexa story, the Amazon Alexa story, just to illustrate that? And as you go and tell the story, you'll go and touch on the specific supporting elements of the story as well.
Yeah. So all right. So that's a great. All right. So the I have the case of how Amazon gets to this dominant position with its smart speaker, the Echo, and the voice assistant Alexa is a beautiful illustration of the concepts and the frameworks for ecosystem construction. That basically, it's interesting. The idea of a smart voice assistant is not new. Okay. It's not novel to Amazon. It's not novel to Apple with Siri or Microsoft with Cortana, I mean, we've had television shows since the 1960s, like Star Trek, that showed us what an intelligent voice assistant is, with Captain Kirk sitting in his chair and asking the computer what was happening around them, and getting a verbal answer.
You wonder how why it took so long on hindsight, right?
So, well, it's two things, right? So, why did it take so long? But two, let's be really clear. This has nothing to do with unique vision of an end goal, right? Hollywood has spent billions of dollars showing us the use case, doing the mock ups, getting consumers excited about that possibility.
All science starts with science fiction. I always tell my
Science
students.
fiction, exactly. It's like the future is already in ink. The So the question is not so clearly, what I'm trying to say is, it's not just about vision. It's really, what's your vision for getting to that endpoint? And this is where this notion of ecosystem construction as a strategy is the heart of new growth, and by the way, ecosystem offense and disruption. So the story of Amazon with the Alexa is interesting because it starts in 2014, where Amazon is nowhere on anybody's list of important technology companies, right? It's a big internet retailer, but it's not, it's never, the only success that it had in consumer electronics, was in 2006 with the Kindle e-reader. Right after that, they had a bunch of Me Too, Fire Stick, Fire Tablet offers. They had a disastrous attempt at coming up with their own smartphone, the Fire Phone. So when they launched the Echo speaker, it's very easy for everybody to dismiss it, and very, very many people and reviewers do dismiss it. And what's interesting is how they take this very modest beginning, what I would talk about as the concept of a minimum viable ecosystem that they launch into the market. The minimum viable ecosystem, it's what you put down with the intent of not getting consumers excited, but being able to attract the next partner and the next partner and the next partner after that, in this process that I term staged expansion. And it's as you expand your partnerships that you actually get to the value proposition that was the motivating vision at the start. So the Alexa story is interesting because Amazon puts out this quite modest device with an intelligent assistant that is dumber than any other assistant on the market at this point, right? Because Apple's got Siri and Google's got their assistant, Microsoft's got their Cortana. They have more users. They have, they've all been in the market longer. But what Amazon does is it puts this out and it combines it with this piece of carryover, which is the Echo speaker had Alexa, but it also had their Prime music streaming service. And so basically what they were selling was not a great speaker with not a great assistant, but with free music streaming that could be on the kitchen counter, and it's a voice operated radio essentially. From there, they don't transform the world. From there, they add the next set of partners, which is they find ways of motivating developers to start developing for this as a platform. Once they have these developers in place, they then open up the Alexa and Echo to other hardware makers with APIs, right? They don't do this on day one. They do this in year 3 or 4 as they're developing the evidence required for these partners to be willing to commit. And after they open up these APIs, they then do the thing which was envisioned from the start, which is they take out the Alexa intelligence from the smart speaker and sell it off individually as Alexa inside chipsets. So that now, rather than talking to your smart speaker and telling it to turn on the lights, you can put the intelligence directly in the light switch. And it's in this way that they move from nowhere into lining up the smart home ecosystem with players who, had they been approached on day one to say, hey, we have this plan, would you let us be in charge? The answer would have been, of course not. But as you unroll a strategy for aligning actors, you can build something that's quite profound. And now, from this position now, obviously they're taking this notion of ambient computing into many places outside of the home. But it's a great illustration of the power of the 3 principles of ecosystem construction: the minimum viable ecosystem, staged expansion, and carryover to jumpstart that MVE.
It's also about imagination, right? Constant imagination of what could be next. How could we go and take this further? How could we make it bigger and go stepwise? The way that I'm thinking about this, check me if what you think on my thinking, is that you got to have your purpose clear, you develop your vision, and then you go and define your where to play choices. And you really decide, here's where I'm going to play. In this space is where I'm going to play. I'm going to learn. I'm going to develop. I'm going to grow. I'll bring other people in. I start with a minimum viable ecosystem. I love the definition, the description. And gradually you move forward. You learn more. You create more possibilities, bigger imagination. And in the end, that leads you to, as you said, a revolution, which was so unlikely, by the way, because as you said, the first step was an unlikely, was an inferior speaker as well as an inferior music portal. Um, so you wonder, why did Bezos not pull the plug earlier on? And that leads to your point that I know you're also very strong about, is that, sorry.
No?
Oh, I thought I heard something, and that leads me to the point about commitment, leadership commitment. Don't pull the plug too early. By the way, one thing that I heard recently is that everybody talks about Netflix, beating Blockbuster. Back to your Kodak story. There's a lot of folklore around that as well. Apparently, the one thing I did not know is that apparently Blockbuster started experimenting with streaming, as well already for several years. They got a new CEO. The new CEO, we're not going to play there, and he killed it. And then Netflix came in, and obviously we know the rest of the history, rest of the story. So
Yeah.
that commitment of leadership, I think, is the point that maybe you want to say a few words around.
Yeah. So I'll say a couple of different things. And the first, just on the list that you went through, everything correct. But I would just make sure that that we add to that list of where you want to play and how you want to play and what you want to play, that you must, in an ecosystem world, give equal billing, not as an afterthought, but as a pre-thought. Who do you want to play with? And how do you make sure that they want to play with you? So the thing that makes the ecosystem story different is partners become just as important as consumers, because without them, you can't create the value proposition. And to your point, it's because of that, because partners come into play, that commitment matters in a totally new way. Right? So if all you're trying to do is figure out what customers want, you can do a lot of experimentation. If you think about like lean startup and A/B testing and all these, very valuable methodologies, most of them have roots in a B2C type space, right? Lean startup has its roots in web pages, where you launch something, and if 50,000 customers don't like it, that's okay. Just change it, because there's another million you can try it with. If that's okay, if it's you and your customer trying to figure things, what works for the customer. If you are reliant on a partner in order to deliver your value proposition to the customer, well, you can't change so frequently and expect your partner to take you seriously. You can't change so frequently and still expect them to dedicate business sensitive resources to this thing that you're trying to figure out. And so if you want to bring partners on board, and by the way, have them follow your leadership as opposed to just be interested in the general space you're in, then you have to be able to say, no, we know where we're going and we are committed. So why don't you commit with us? And what's interesting, Bezos actually he was on a patent from 2006 about voice and internet retail transactions. So this was a vision that he was fully behind. And I would say the thing that sets the Amazon story apart, we can talk about how generalizable that makes it, but it really is a story of a long-term commitment, right? And what I would say is any successful ecosystem leader, it's very hard to find somebody who pivots their way to success where they need to align other partners, right? You can pivot your way to success when you need to find market fit, but partnership is a different game.
So leadership becomes grounded also in very different dynamics, right? Different fundamentals. I mean, previous leadership in one industry kind of environment is all about antagonism. Antagonism, I guess, is English, right?
Right.
You win or you lose. In this case, becomes much more, around intentional, deliberate relationship building, having the right conversations, obviously with a consistent yet iterative strategy.
Yeah.
Fascinating.
So actually, so chapter 6 of this book is all about leadership mindset required, and I draw this contrast between an execution mindset and an alignment mindset that's required of leadership. And I make it really clear an execution mindset, which is, if you think about, like Jim Collins, who I'm a huge fan of, like a level 5 leader is a leader who puts their organization ahead of themselves and has vision for where they want to go. And it's tremendous. That is a super perspective in an industry world. But if you're trying to line up other partners and you're known as always putting your company first, right? That makes it a lot harder for other people to become reliant on you. So there's this trade-off between an execution mindset and an alignment mindset. One puts the company first, one puts the coalition first. And what's really clear is it's not that one is better than the other. It's that depending on the state of the context that you're trying to lead in, sometimes you need an execution mindset, sometimes you need an alignment mindset. And there's a real tension between the two. And so what that means is both in what it is you want to bring from yourself, what it is that you want to, as you're selecting leaders for different jobs, you need to understand the nature of the alignment challenge and use that to inform who it is that you put in charge of these ventures. There's the case study in the chapter, which to me was so fascinating, was the contrast in Microsoft between Steve Ballmer and Satya Nadella as exemplars of what an amazing execution mindset looks like and an amazing alignment mindset looks like. And what's interesting is it was under Ballmer that Microsoft made all the investments in the cloud and Azure, et cetera, that actually Nadella was the president of Azure under Ballmer. But, it was a very forgettable venture. It was only when you had this alignment mindset leader, and I talk about kind of dynamics he fosters there, that you're able to unlock an ecosystem strategy and actually get very, very meaningful success.
Yeah, I like that. I like that point a lot. And I think you forgot to mention one of my favorite quotes that you brought, which is related to the focus of leadership on alignment, collaboration versus winning. Is don't talk about ecosystems, talk about ecosystems. And
Yes.
I think many leaders / companies are still, do my way or the highway, right? So that's another important element in here. Hey, I wanted to. I guess we're getting to our time here. Yeah, we're already over time, but I love to hear your points. They're very wise. I know you have a third story that you wanted to tell. Maybe just go and do that as the slam dunk
Oh,
to
so
illustrate.
yeah. So I guess there's a great case study in the book on Assa Abloy. And the reason I want to highlight it is because Assa Abloy is a Nordic industrial player, right? Assa and Abloy are both over 100 years old. They start off as makers of mechanical locks and keys. And their journey starts under the watchful eye of European private equity. And now they're in the public market. And the reason that's an important context is because it's important to dismiss the notion that this ecosystem story is just for high-tech firms, or it's a luxury that only VC-backed firms or ridiculously valued tech firms get to play in. So the Assa Abloy story is a story of how they transformed themselves from a dominant maker of mechanical locks and keys to the keeper of digital identity. Right. So if you ever went to a hotel and used your phone, used a magnetic card, used a card, or now your phone to open your hotel door, that's most likely an Assa Abloy innovation. And the story of how they move from this position of a commodity supplier in the ecosystem to a partner, to now having more and more of a seat at the table as they're collaborating with Android and iOS, and now actually moving into government identity in a digital world, is a beautiful story of both ecosystem construction, of ecosystem carryover, of the huge benefits that only accrue from incumbency, but also dismisses the notion that this is a game for just Silicon Valley darlings. This is what everybody is facing today, and I would really argue that my hope is that the tools and the frameworks in this book are helpful to just about anybody on this journey, from executives to policymakers to investors and beyond.
Yeah, I really found your book so constructive and it's like a script that people can go and apply. That is all grounded in history, sets you off into the future, and indeed look multidimensional into all the stakeholders that can and should play a role in every respective ecosystem. And yes, absolutely, it's not about Silicon Valley. This can happen in the consumer goods business. It actually is already illustrated. It's happening in the automotive business, and so that's another already pretty clear illustration. Hey, I
Absolutely.
wanted to get gradually to closure, and wanted to ask you in this conversation, is the one thing that we didn't ask, that we didn't discuss, that you really want to reinforce and make sure that our audience hears?
I would say that for all the frameworks in this book, which I hope everybody in the audience picks up and reads and it's useful to them, that it is as important to be able to use these concepts as a shared language in your organization as it is to craft the initial strategy. That the challenges that we're facing today require not just new strategy tools, but new strategy language. And I hope that this book contributes to that. And by the way, and again, in that regard, this is why at least the first chapter is fully online and free for sharing, so that anyone interested can share this language and already have a conversation on the basis of that first chapter that hopefully will please read the whole book. There's a reason why I wrote all the chapters. But I think this is essential for effectiveness in the world that we're confronting.
Thank you for contributing to a better world, Ron. This is a real pleasure to hear you, and hopefully, I'm sure our listeners are going to benefit from this greatly. I wish you lots of success in getting your book read. I know that it's available everywhere. I asked you the question before, and you were surprised I asked you the question. It's available everywhere on your website. It's available on Amazon, and in your local bookstore, I'm sure. So pick up a copy and really leverage it. This is for business leaders. This is for innovation leaders. This is for chief technology officers to go and get themselves more towards that customer value creation. And it's also to help you influence others in your organization. I know that many innovators are frustrated because they have got great thoughts and they believe they have the next best invention that could lead to innovation, but then they don't get the ear of the C-suite partners. And this is a way. This again, because it is a construct. It's a framework that allows you to really move on and influence others and pull others internally with you, and from there pull others externally with you, which is exactly what ecosystems are all about, right? As I always say, a culture of an ecosystem starts at the inside. So don't overlook that. Ron, thank you so much. It was a real pleasure talking to you, and that is very sincere. And let's stay in touch. I want to discover more with you. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you, John. This was a great pleasure. Great conversation.
And to our listeners, if you enjoyed this episode, then please remember to subscribe to our Off the Shelf podcast series, or explore the entire catalog of podcast programming from the Conference Board by visiting our website at tcb.org/podcast. I hope you found this worth your while. Whenever you can give feedback in places, then please do. We'd love to hear from you and engage with our broader array of products at the Conference Board at any time. Thanks again, Ron. Thanks again, audience. This session is closed.
This has been Off the Shelf, a podcast by the Conference Board.
Looking for additional business insights in this subject area and beyond this podcast, go to tcb.org and explore our Human Capital Centre. Uncover a large array of products hosted by the Conference Board in focus areas like diversity and inclusion, talent management, and many others. Products include peer-to-peer networking events, expert briefings, publications, data and analysis, webcasts, videos and blogs.